My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 58 years old. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. The moment that changed my life forever happened at my husband's funeral when I received a text message that made my world collapse all over again. It was October 15, a gray and cold Tuesday morning, the kind of day that matches your soul when you're burying the love of your life. I stood beside David's mahogany casket at St. Mary's Cemetery, wearing the black dress he had always said made my eyes look beautiful. 32 years of marriage, and I was saying goodbye to the only man I had ever truly loved. The pastor's words about eternal rest and meeting again in heaven felt hollow in my ears. All I could think about was how David would never again make me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, never again surprise me with wildflowers from our garden, never again hold me during thunderstorms because he knew they scared me. My brother-in-law Michael stood beside me, his strong hand on my shoulder as I sobbed. Michael had been our rock through everything. When David collapsed at the construction site 6 days earlier, Michael was the one who called the ambulance. He handled all the funeral arrangements while I could barely get out of bed. David's younger brother had become the family I never had, and in my darkest hour he was holding me together. The cemetery was full of people whose lives David had touched. His construction workers, fellow contractors, neighbors whose homes he had built, and my teaching colleagues who had watched our love story unfold over decades. David was the kind of man who helped others without expecting anything in return. He built wheelchair ramps for elderly neighbors, donated materials to Habitat for Humanity, and always paid his workers fair wages, even when money was tight. As the pastor began the final prayer, I felt my phone vibrate in my purse. I ignored it at first. Nothing could be more important than these final moments with my husband. But it vibrated again, then again. Something made me reach for it, maybe just to turn it off so nothing could disturb this sacred goodbye. The screen showed a text from a number I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking so badly from grief and cold that I could barely read it. When I finally focused on the words, my heart stopped beating. Sarah, it's me. I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin. Trust no one, especially not my brother. The phone slipped from my hands and hit the wet grass. I stared down at it like it was a snake that had bitten me. My mind couldn't process what I had just read. David was dead. I had seen him in the hospital, unconscious and connected to machines that couldn't save him. I had kissed his forehead one last time before they turned off life support. This message was impossible. Sarah, are you okay? Michael whispered, bending down to pick up my phone. His concerned eyes met mine, and for the first time in 6 days, I looked at him differently. The message had said not to trust him. But this was Michael, David's beloved younger brother, the man who had cried harder than anyone when David died. I'm fine, I lied, quickly taking the phone back before he could see the screen. Just dizzy. But I wasn't fine. Nothing would ever be fine again because either I was losing my mind from grief or the impossible was true. Either way, my world had just shattered for the second time in a week. The graveside service continued around me, but I heard nothing. My eyes kept moving from the mahogany casket to Michael's face, searching for something I couldn't name. He looked exactly as he had for the past 6 days, devastated, supportive, genuine in his grief. If David was really alive, if that message was real, then everything I thought I knew about the past week was a lie. When the time came to throw dirt on the casket, I couldn't move. The sound of soil hitting wood was supposed to be final, supposed to give closure. Instead, it felt like a cruel joke. Michael had to support my weight as my legs gave out. The other mourners probably thought it was normal grief, the widow finally accepting her loss. They had no idea I was questioning whether there had been a loss at all. After the burial, People came to offer condolences. They hugged me and shared memories of David, talking about what a good man he had been, how much he would be missed. Their past tense words felt wrong now. Had been? Would be missed? What if David wasn't past tense at all? Michael drove me home to the house David had built with his own hands 30 years ago. Every room held memories of our life together. The kitchen where we danced while cooking dinner. The living room was where we watched movies every Friday night. The workshop where David spent hours creating beautiful furniture that filled was our home. "I'll stay with you tonight," Michael offered as we walked through the front door. "Linda understands. You shouldn't be alone." "No," I said quickly, surprising myself. "I need some time by myself to process everything." Michael looked hurt, but he nodded. "I understand. But call me if you need anything. Day or night. We're family, Sarah. David would want me to take care of you. David would want him to take care of me. But if that message was real, David was still able to take care of me himself." After Michael left, I sat in David's favorite chair and stared at my phone. The message was still there, still impossible, still turning my world upside down. I read it over and over until the words were burned into my memory. "Sarah, it's me. I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin. Trust no one, especially not my brother." The rational part of my mind said this was grief playing tricks on me. People see and hear things that aren't there when they lose someone they love. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke, or maybe it was a wrong number that coincidentally used David's name. But something deeper, something in my gut, was screaming that this message was real. David had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death. More secretive, more worried, making phone calls he wouldn't explain. I had thought strangely just business stress, but what if it was something more dangerous? As night fell and I sat alone in our house, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of dismissing the message as impossible, I was going to find out the truth. If David was really dead, I needed to know for sure so I could grieve properly. If he were somehow alive, I needed to find him. But the message had been clear about one thing. Trust no one, especially not Michael. The man who had been my rock through David's death was apparently the one person I couldn't trust, which meant I was completely alone in searching for a truth that might destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. I looked around the house David built, filled with furniture David made, decorated with photos of our 32 years together. Either my husband was dead and buried, or I was losing my mind. Or my husband had faked his own death, and everyone I trusted was lying to me. Both possibilities were terrifying. But I was about to discover that the truth was even worse than I could imagine. To understand how impossible that message seemed, you need to know about the life David and I had built together. We weren't rich or famous, but we had something money can't buy. We had real love, the kind that grows stronger through hard times instead of breaking apart. I met David Mitchell when I was 26 years old. It was 1989, and I had just started teaching third grade at Millbrook Elementary School. I was young, idealistic, and determined to make a difference in children's lives. David was 28, a construction foreman with calloused hands and the kindest eyes I had ever seen. Our first meeting was hardly romantic. My landlord had hired David's crew to fix the sagging porch of my rental house. I came home from school to find this tall, broad-shouldered man covered in sawdust, replacing rotted boards with careful precision. When he looked up and smiled, something in my chest fluttered that had nothing to do with the October wind. "You must be the teacher," he said, pulling off his work gloves. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you work with kids. That takes a special person. Most men I dated were intimidated by my education or bored by my stories about classroom adventures. David was different. He listened when I talked about my students, asked thoughtful questions, and shared his own dreams of building something lasting with his hands. Our courtship was simple but perfect. David would pick me up after school in his old Ford pickup, still dusty from construction sites, but clean inside because he respected me enough to care about details. We'd drive to the lake and talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up poor with his younger brother, Micah, after their parents died in a car accident. I told him about my dream of making education my life's work. "I buy Eld House S," he said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the water gold. "But you're building futures. That's more important than anything I'll ever do." That's when I knew I was falling in love. Not with his strong arms or handsome face, but with his heart that saw value in everyone around him. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and it wasn't some grand romantic gesture with expensive rings and fancy restaurants. David proposed on the construction site where he was building our future home. He had spent months designing and planning it, working evenings and weekends to create something just for us. "Sarah," he said, still wearing his work clothes and hard hat, "I built this house for us. Will you marry me and help me make it a home?" The engagement ring was modest, but the house was everything. 3 bedrooms in case we had children, a big kitchen for family dinners, a workshop where David could create beautiful furniture, and a front porch where we could grow old together watching sunsets. Our wedding in 1991 was small but perfect. The whole town came because David had worked on half their houses, and I had taught their children. Michael was David's best man, and even then, I could see how much he looked up to his older brother. David wasn't just Michael's sibling. He was his hero, his father figure, his guide through life. The early years of marriage tested us in ways we hadn't expected. David's construction business struggled during the recession of the early 90s. There were months when we lived on my teacher's salary and ate a lot of pasta and hope. David would come home frustrated, worried about providing for me, and afraid his dreams were too big for his abilities. "We'll make it," I would tell him during those difficult nights. We hand-V each other. That's enough. And it was enough. David's business slowly grew as his reputation for quality work spread throughout the county. He wasn't the cheapest contractor, but he was honest, reliable, and took pride in every project. Homeowners learned that hiring David Mitchell meant the job would be done right the first time. By the mid-90s, David Construction was doing well enough to hire regular workers. Michael had graduated from high school and immediately joined the business. David taught him everything about construction, from reading blueprints to managing crews. Michael was a quick learner and had natural leadership skills, but he always deferred to David's experience and wisdom. "My brother built this company from nothing," Michael would tell clients. "I'm just lucky enough to learn from the best." We made the decision not to have children after several years of trying. It wasn't meant to be, and while it brought sadness, it also brought us closer together. We poured our parental instincts into Michael and his future family, and into the students I taught year after year. "We're complete," David would say when people asked about children. "Some couples need kids to be a family. We're already a family." The 2000s brought prosperity and happiness. David's business was thriving, building custom homes for wealthy clients from the city who wanted weekend retreats in our rural area. I had earned my master's degree in education and became a respected teacher in our school district. We traveled together, taking annual trips to national parks, where David became a photographer of landscapes, and I would collect rocks and wildflowers for my classroom nature displays. But our favorite place was always the mountain cabin we bought in 2003. It was a simple 2-bedroom log cabin on 20 acres of forest, 3 hours' drive from Millbrook. David spent weekends renovating it, turning it into our private paradise. We would go there to hours a neck from the world, to hike and fish, and remember why we fell in love with each other and with the simple life we had chosen. Michael married Linda in 2005, a sweet girl from the next town over who worked as a nurse. David and I were their unofficial parents at the wedding since Michael had no one else to walk him down the aisle or give father of the bride speeches. When their children were born, first Emma in 2007, then Jake in 2009, we became the devoted aunt and uncle we had always wanted to be. Family dinners at our house became a weekly tradition. Every Sunday, Michael and Linda would bring the kids over for home-cooked meals and games in the backyard David had carefully landscaped. Emma would help me in the garden while Jake followed David around the workshop, learning to use tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. "You're the best parent we've ever had," Linda would tell us. "The kids are so lucky to have you." Those were the golden years when everything in Weaver ever felt balanced and right. David's business was successful, but not overwhelming. My teaching career was fulfilling. Our marriage had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. We had Michael's family to love and nurture. We had our cabin retreat for romance and renewal. We had built exactly the life we had dreamed of as young people. But looking back now, I realize those perfect years contained the seeds of what would destroy everything. David's business success made him a target. His trusting nature made him vulnerable. His love for his brother made him blind to the anger that was growing closer every day. The first signs of trouble began in early 2021. David started taking phone calls that he wouldn't discuss, conversations that made him frown and pace around the house afterward. When I asked about them, he would say it was just business problems, nothing for me to worry about. "The construction industry is changing," he explained. "Lots of new regulations, more competition. Michael and I are working through some challenges." Michael seemed different too, more stressed and secretive. He would visit our house at odd hours, having intense conversations with David in the WO workshop where they thought I couldn't hear. Their voices were always too low for me to make out words, but the tone was serious, sometimes urgent. David also became more security conscious. He installed new locks on our doors and started asking me to call when I arrived safely at school or when I was leaving for home. When I questioned this new behavior, he said there had been break-ins in the area and he was just being cautious. "You're the most precious thing in my world, Sarah. I just want to make sure you're safe." The changes were subtle enough that I didn't worry too much. David had always been protective, and the construction business had always had its ups and downs. I was busy with my own work, preparing students for state tests, and dealing with budget cuts that were affecting our school district. I trusted David to handle his business concerns and assumed everything would work out as it always had. Our last really perfect day was in September 2021, just a month before David's death. We drove up to the cabin for what we didn't know would be our final weekend together. The autumn colors were spectacular, and David spent hours photographing the changing leaves while I read on the porch swing he had built years earlier. "I love you, Sarah," he said that evening as we watched the sunset from our favorite spot by the lake. "Whatever happens, remember that you were the best thing that ever happened to me." At the time, I thought it was just one of his romantic moments. David had always been good with words when it came to expressing his love. I had no idea he was saying goodbye, that he somehow knew our perfect life was about to end. When we drove back to Millbrook that Sunday evening, David was quiet and thoughtful. I asked if something was bothering him, but he just squeezed my hand and said he was grateful for everything we had built together. "Promise me something," he said as we pulled into our driveway. "If anything ever happens to me, don't trust anyone completely, not even family. People change when money gets involved." I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. Nothing was going to happen to him. We were going to grow old together in the house he built, surrounded by Michael's children and grandchildren, living the simple, honest life we had always wanted. 3 weeks later, David was dead. Or at least, that's what everyone believed until that impossible text message at his funeral changed everything. The morning of October 9th started like any other Tuesday. David kissed me goodbye at 6:30 a.m. as I got ready for school, promising to be home by dinner to help me grade papers. He grabbed his thermos of coffee and the lunch I had packed, the same routine we'd followed for 30 years. "Love you, beautiful," he said, words that had become as natural as breathing. "Love you too. Be safe at the site." Those were the last words we spoke to each other. At least, that's what I thought until that message at the funeral. I was in the middle of teaching fractions to my third graders when Principal Williams knocked on my classroom door at 10:15 a.m. Her face was pale, and she asked if she could speak with me privately in the hallway. "Sarah, I need you to sit down," she said, guiding me to a chair in the empty corridor. "There's been an accident. David collapsed at the construction site. Michael called an ambulance, and they've taken him to County General Hospital." The world tilted sideways. David was only 60 years old and in perfect health. He worked out regularly, ate well, and had just had his annual physical 2 months earlier with glowing results. Heart attacks didn't happen to men like David. "Is he conscious? Can I talk to him?" I asked, already reaching for my purse. "I don't know the details. Michael is meeting you at the hospital. Go. We'll handle everything here." The drive to County General was a blur of fear and desperate prayers. I kept telling myself that David was strong, that whatever had happened, he would recover. We had too many plans, too many dreams still to fulfill. We were supposed to retire together in 5 years and spend more time at the cabin. We were supposed to watch Emma and Jake graduate from high school. We were supposed to grow old together on that front porch David had built with his own hands. Michael was waiting for me in the emergency room, his work clothes dusty and his face streaked with tears. The sight of David's strong younger brother crying like a child made my legs weak. "Sarah, thank God you're here," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt desperate. "The doctors are with him now. It was a massive heart attack." I tried CPR until the paramedics arrived, but he was unconscious the whole time. "What exactly happened?" I asked, needing to understand how our perfect morning had turned into this nightmare. Michael led me to a quiet corner of the waiting room, his hands shaking as he spoke. We were reviewing blueprints for the Johnson House project. David seemed fine, making jokes about the client's ridiculous requests for a wine cellar. Then he just clutched his chest and collapsed. No warning, no signs of distress. One minute he was laughing, the next minute he was on the ground. The image of David collapsing alone, fighting for his life while I taught children about fractions, haunted me. I should have been there. Somehow, I should have known. Dr. Martinez, the cardiac surgeon, found us 2 hours later. His expression prepared me for bad news, but nothing could have prepared me for how bad it really was. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband suffered what we call a widowmaker heart attack. The main artery to his heart was completely blocked. By the time the paramedics restored his heartbeat, he had been without oxygen for several critical minutes. There's extensive damage to his heart muscle and possible brain damage from oxygen deprivation." "But he's alive?" I whispered. "He's on life support. We've put him in a medically induced coma to reduce stress on his system, but I need you to understand that his condition is very grave. The next 48 hours will be critical." I demanded to see him immediately. When I walked into the ICU room, my knees nearly buckled. David looked so small and vulnerable, connected to machines that were keeping him alive. His face was peaceful, almost like he was just sleeping, but the sounds as the ventilator and heart monitors reminded me that he was fighting for every breath. I'm here, sweetheart, I whispered, taking his hand. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay. For 2 days, I barely left his side. Michael brought me changes of clothes and food I couldn't eat. Linda and the children came to visit, Emma crying as she saw her beloved uncle surrounded by medical equipment. Friends from school sent flowers and cards. The whole community was praying for David's recovery. But on Thursday evening, Dr. Martinez called me into the family conference room with an expression I'll never forget. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm very sorry, but your husband's condition has deteriorated. The heart damage is too extensive, and we've detected significant brain swelling. He's not responding to any stimuli. I believe it's time to discuss end-of-life decisions. The words hit me like physical blows. You're giving up on him? It's only been 2 days. I understand this is devastating, but keeping him on life support indefinitely won't change the outcome. The kindest thing might be to let him go peacefully, surrounded by the people who love him. Michael held me as I sobbed, his own tears falling freely. Sarah, David wouldn't want to live like this. You know he wouldn't want to be kept alive by machines with no hope of recovery. Through my grief, I knew they were right. David had always said he wanted to die with dignity when his time came. The man I loved was already gone. The machines were just prolonging the inevitable. On Friday at 8:47 a.m., we decided to remove life support. I held David's hand as his heartbeat slowed, and finally, he, love of my decided for 32 years, was gone. What followed was a blur of arrangements and obligations that felt surreal. Michael handled everything with efficiency that I was grateful for, but too numb to question. He contacted the funeral home, arranged for David's body to be transported, and started making lists of people who needed to be notified. David always said he wanted a simple service, if anything happened, Michael told me. Nothing fancy or expensive, just family and friends sharing good memories. But I want to see him one more time, I said. At the funeral home, before the service, Michael's expression flickered with something I couldn't identify. Sarah, the doctors recommended a closed casket, the CPR and medical procedures. It would be better to remember him as he was. I was too grief-stricken to argue. Michael had been there when David collapsed, had seen what I hadn't. If he thought it was better this way, I would trust his judgment. The funeral arrangements continued around me while I existed in a fog of disbelief. David's life insurance company was contacted a policy I vaguely remembered him increasing a few months earlier, though I couldn't recall the details. His business affairs needed to be sorted out, with Michael explaining that there were some outstanding debts and complicated contracts that would take time to resolve. Don't worry about any of the business stuff, Michael assured me. David and I were partners. I'll handle everything and make sure you're taken care of. That's what brothers do. Looking back, I realize how many questions I should have asked during those days. Why had David increased his life insurance without discussing it with me? What kind of debts did the business have that I didn't know about? Why was Michael so insistent on handling everything without including me in decisions about my own husband's affairs? But grief makes you vulnerable to people who seem to have your best interests at heart. I was drowning in loss, and Michael threw me lifelines that I grabbed without examining them too closely. The night before the funeral, I sat in David's workshop surrounded by the furniture he had created over the years. Every piece told a story of his skill and love. The rocking chair he made when we thought we might have children. The dining room table where we had hosted countless family dinners. The jewelry box he crafted for my birthday, with secret compartments, he showed me with such pride. I don't know how to live without you, I whispered to the empty room. 32 years, and I still don't know who I am when you're not here. That's when I found David's cell phone, tucked behind his workbench, where he always left it when he was working on projects. It was dead, but something made me slip it into my pocket. Maybe I hoped there would be voicemails from him, final words I hadn't heard. Maybe I just wanted something of his that no one else had touched. I had no idea that phone would become the key to discovering the truth about David's death and the conspiracy that had destroyed our perfect life. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cold, matching the emptiness in my heart. As I dressed in my black dress and prepared to say goodbye to my husband forever, I thought the worst pain was behind me. I was wrong. The worst was yet to come, beginning with that impossible text message that would turn my world upside down and force me to question everything I thought I knew about the people I trusted most. That night after the funeral, I sat alone in our house with David's old work phone charging on the kitchen table. My hands were shaking as I waited for it to power up, half hoping it would reveal nothing but old work emails and half terrified of what I might find. The phone finally came to life at 11:30 p.m., and immediately, messages started coming in from that same unknown number. "Sarah, I know this is impossible to believe. I know you just buried someone you thought was me. But I need you to listen carefully. Your life depends on it." The man in that coffin was John Morrison, a homeless man who died of a heart attack at County General 3 days before my accident. Michael paid someone at the morgue to switch the bodies. I had to let you grieve. I had to let everyone believe I was dead. It was the only way to protect you and expose the truth about what Michael has been doing. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that someone was playing a cruel joke on a grieving widow. But the messages contained details that only David would know. They mentioned the secret compartment in the jewelry box he made me, the place where I kept my grandmother's wedding ring. They referenced conversations we'd had at the cabin that no one else could have overheard. The next message made me gasp out loud, "Check the cabin tomorrow. Look in the old toolbox in the basement workshop. I left evidence there that will explain everything. But Sarah, you have to be very careful. Michael is not who you think he is, and you're in more danger than you realize." I stared at the phone screen until my eyes burned. Either I was having a complete mental breakdown, or David was somehow alive and in hiding. Both possibilities seemed equally terrifying. At 2 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to drive to the cabin and look in that toolbox. If I found nothing, I would know the messages were fake, and I could try to heal from this additional trauma. If I found something, I would have to face the impossible truth that my husband had faked his own death. But first, I did something I had never done in 32 years of marriage. I searched through David's personal papers looking for secrets. In his desk drawer, underneath old business receipts and tax documents, I found a manila envelope with my name written on it in David's handwriting. Inside were bank statements from an account I didn't know existed, containing almost $50,000. There were also receipts for a storage unit I had never heard of, and a business card for someone named Jake Morrison, private investigator. My hands trembled as I dialed Jake Morrison's number. It was 3 a.m., but he answered on the second ring as if he had been expecting my call. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said before I could even identify myself, "David told me you might call. I'm so sorry for what you've had to go through. You know about the messages?" I whispered. "I know about everything. David hired me 6 weeks ago when he realized his life was in danger. We've been planning this for over a month." "Planning what?" "Planning to let me think my husband was dead? Planning to put me through hell while you played your games? Planning to keep you alive," Jake said quietly. "Sarah, David discovered that Michael has been using the construction company to launder money for some very dangerous people. When David threatened to expose him, Michael decided his own brother had to die. We couldn't go to the police because we weren't sure who else was involved. The only way to protect you and gather enough evidence was to let Michael think his plan had succeeded. I sank into David's chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Where is David now? Is he really alive? He's safe, but I can't tell you where over the phone. What I can tell you is that you need to be very careful around Michael. As far as he knows, you're just a grieving widow who doesn't suspect anything. But if he realizes you're asking questions or investigating David's death, you'll become a liability he needs to eliminate. The next morning, I called in sick to school for the first time in 10 years and drove to our cabin. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think about all the small things that hadn't made sense about David's death. Michael's insistence on a closed casket, his efficiency in handling all the arrangements, the way he had discouraged me from asking questions about the business or David's final day. The cabin looked exactly as we had left it after our last weekend together in September. David's coffee mug was still in the sink. My book was still open on the porch swing. But now, these familiar objects felt like evidence of a conspiracy I was only beginning to understand. The basement workshop was David's private domain, filled with tools and projects he worked on during our cabin weekends. The old toolbox Jake had mentioned was tucked in a corner, covered by a dusty tarp. Inside, I found a collection of items that shattered my understanding of the past 6 months. There were photographs of Michael meeting with men in expensive suits at locations around town. Bank records show large cash deposits into accounts connected to the construction company. Recorded conversations on a small digital device that I didn't even know David owned. But the most shocking discovery was a detailed timeline in David's handwriting, documenting how Michael had gradually gotten involved with money laundering and how the scheme had grown larger and more dangerous over time. According to David's notes, it started small. Michael was approached by Vincent Romano, a businessman who needed help moving cash through legitimate enterprises. Michael was offered $20,000 to allow a few fake invoices to be processed through David Construction. Michael rationalized it as a victimless crime that would help pay off gambling debts he had hidden from Linda and David. But once Michael was involved, there was no way out. The amounts got larger, the demands more frequent. Vincent Romano wasn't just a businessman, he was connected to organized crime, and David Construction was becoming a crucial part of their money laundering operation. David's notes showed that he had discovered the scheme by accident in August. He noticed discrepancies in the company books, invoices for materials that were never delivered, and payments to subcontractors who didn't exist. When he confronted Michael, his brother broke down and confessed everything. And Michael begged me not to go to the police, David had written. He said Romano's people would kill his whole family if they found out he had talked. He promised to extricate himself from the situation gradually, to find a way out that wouldn't put Linda and the children in danger. But David soon realized that Michael was lying. Instead of ending his involvement with Romano, Michael was trying to convince David to become an active participant in the scheme. When David refused and threatened to expose everything, Michael made a desperate choice. "My own brother is going to have me killed," the final entry read. "He's chosen money and criminals over family. I can't go to the police because I'm not sure who else is involved, and I can't run because that would put Sarah in danger. The only solution is to let Michael think he's succeeded while I gather evidence from hiding. If you're reading this, Sarah, it means our plan worked. I'm alive, and soon we'll have enough evidence to put Michael and Romano in prison where they belong." I sat on the basement floor surrounded by evidence of betrayal that went deeper than I had imagined. Not only had Michael planned David's murder, but he had been stealing from the company and putting our entire family at risk by associating with dangerous criminals. The sound of a car engine outside made me freeze. Through the basement window, I could see Michael's truck pulling into our driveway. I quickly gathered all the evidence and shoved it back into the toolbox, then climbed the stairs to meet him. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he would be able to hear it. "Sarah?" Michael called as he knocked on the front door. "I was worried when you didn't answer your phone. Are you okay?" I opened the door with what I hoped was a normal expression, though inside I was screaming. This man, who had been like a brother to me, who had held me while I cried at David's funeral, was actually his murderer. "I needed some time alone," I said, "to feel close to David." Michael's eyes were scanning the cabin looking for signs of what I had been doing. "I understand, but it's not safe for you to be up here alone. What if something happened? What if you had car trouble or got sick?" "I'm fine, Michael. I just needed to remember the good times David and I shared here." "Of course," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I brought some of David's business papers that need your signature. Life insurance forms, final invoices, that sort of thing." He handed me a folder full of documents that I pretended to review but couldn't focus on. All I could think about was the evidence hidden in the basement and David alive somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your future," Michael continued. "The house is going to be lonely without David. Linda and I were wondering if you'd like to move closer to us, maybe find a smaller place that's easier to maintain." "I haven't thought about moving. David built that house for us." "I know, but David would want you to be practical. The life insurance money will give you options. We could help you find something nice, maybe invest the rest so you have a steady income." There it was. Michael was already thinking about David's life insurance money, already planning how to get his hands on it. I wondered how much of it he thought he deserved for orchestrating his brother's fake death. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any major decisions yet." Michael nodded, but I could see frustration flickering in his eyes. "Of course. Just know that Linda and I are here for you. David made me promise to take care of you if anything ever happened to him." After he left, I called Jake Morrison again. This time, we arranged to meet in person at a diner 2 towns over, somewhere Michael wouldn't expect to see me. Jake was a thin man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and careful mannerisms. He looked like someone who had spent years watching people and learning their secrets. "David is safe," he told me before I could even ask. "He's staying at a secure location while we gather the final pieces of evidence we need to bring down Romano's operation." "When can I see him? When can this nightmare end?" "Soon. But first, you need to understand how dangerous this situation really is. Michael isn't just laundering money anymore. Romano's organization has been using David Construction to transport drugs hidden in building materials. When David discovered that, he realized he couldn't just walk away quietly. This whole operation needs to be exposed." Jake showed me photographs and documents that painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond what I had found at the cabin. Michael had gotten involved with people who killed anyone who threatened their business. David's fake death had bought us time, but it wouldn't protect us forever. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Act normal. Don't let Michael suspect that you know anything. We're working with federal agents to build a case, but we need Michael to feel secure enough to continue his normal activities. If he realizes David might still be alive, he'll disappear, and we'll never be able to prove what he's done." That evening, I returned home and tried to resume the routine of a grieving widow. I cooked dinner I didn't eat, graded papers I couldn't concentrate on, and answered sympathy calls from friends who had no idea that my husband's death was an elaborate deception designed to catch a killer. The hardest part was lying to people who genuinely cared about me. My teaching colleagues, my neighbors, and the friends who brought casseroles and offered to help with household repairs. They were mourning David's death alongside me, sharing memories and offering comfort that I couldn't fully accept because I knew it was based on a lie. But the alternative was putting everyone at risk. If Michael discovered that David was alive, he would have no choice but to eliminate everyone who knew the truth. My grief might be fake, but the danger was absolutely real. Over the next few days, I received more messages from David's phone, always late at night when Michael wouldn't be watching. I miss you more than words can say. I know this is the hardest thing I've ever asked you to do, but it's almost over. Romano is getting sloppy because he thinks the threat to his operation died with me. I've been watching you from a distance. I saw you plant flowers on my grave yesterday. I wanted to run to you, to hold you, to end this charade. But we're so close to having everything we need. Michael is planning something. Be extra careful. Don't let him into the house alone and don't accept any food or drinks he offers you. I know this sounds paranoid, but these people have killed before. The warning about food and drinks chilled me. Was Michael planning to poison me the way he had presumably planned to poison David? The thought that I had been hugging my husband's would-be murderer, trusting him with my grief and my future, made me physically sick. 3 days after I visited the cabin, Michael showed up at my house with takeout from our favorite Chinese restaurant. I thought you might not be eating properly, he said, unpacking containers of food. David always worried about you forgetting to eat when you got stressed. I stared at the food, remembering David's warning. That's so thoughtful, but I actually just ate. Why don't you put it in the refrigerator and I'll have it tomorrow? Michael's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment or annoyance. Are you sure? It's better when it's hot. I'm sure. My stomach has been upset since the funeral. After Michael left, I threw away every bit of food he had brought. I couldn't prove it was poisoned, but I wasn't taking any chances. That night, I received the message I had been both hoping for and dreading tomorrow night. Everything ends tomorrow night. Jake will contact you with the details. I love you, Sarah. This will all be over soon, and we can start healing from what my brother has put us through. The next morning, Jake Morrison called me at 6 a.m. with instructions that made my blood run cold. Tonight, Michael is meeting with Vincent Romano and his associates at the construction company office. They're planning to finalize a major drug shipment that's being hidden in building supplies for a new housing development. We need you to get Michael out of the house so we can search for additional evidence without him knowing. How am I supposed to do that? I can't just call and ask him to come over. You don't have to. Michael has been waiting for an excuse to visit you again. Call him and say you found some of David's papers that you need help understanding. Business documents that are confusing you. He'll come running because he needs to know what you might have discovered. The plan was simple but terrifying. I would keep Michael busy at my house while federal agents searched his home and office for evidence. David would be watching from a surveillance van parked down the street, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. At 7 p.m., I called Michael with hands that shook so badly I could barely dial the number. Michael, I'm sorry to bother you, but I found some papers in David's desk that don't make sense to me. Business contracts and invoices that seem unusual. Could you come over and help me understand what they mean? Of course, Sarah. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, Michael arrived at my door carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the concerned expression he had perfected over the past 2 weeks. You sounded upset on the phone, he said, following me into the living room. What kind of papers did you find? I showed him a collection of legitimate business documents that Jake had helped me select, papers that would seem confusing to someone unfamiliar with construction, but wouldn't reveal anything about our investigation. Michael relaxed as he looked through the invoices and contracts. These are just normal business expenses, Sarah. Payments to suppliers, contractor agreements, nothing unusual. But some of these amounts seem very large, and I don't recognize some of these company names. Michael spent the next hour patiently explaining construction industry practices, playing the role of helpful brother-in-law while I played the role of confused widow. All the while, I knew that federal agents were searching through his house and office, looking for evidence that would destroy him. My phone buzzed with a text message that Michael couldn't see. We found it. More evidence than we ever hoped for. Keep him there for another 30 minutes. Michael, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I've been thinking about what you said about selling the house. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to make some changes. His eyes lit up with interest that he tried to hide behind sympathy. I know it's a difficult decision, but David would want you to be happy and secure. The life insurance money, how much was it again? I know David increased the policy, but I can't remember the details. $500,000. Enough to buy a nice smaller house and have money left over for retirement. $500,000. No wonder Michael had been so eager to help with the funeral arrangements and business paperwork. I wondered how much of that money he expected to receive as David's business partner. That seems like a lot of money to manage on my own, I said carefully. Do you think you could help me make investment decisions? Michael leaned forward eagerly. Absolutely. David and I discussed this possibility. He worried about leaving you alone to deal with financial matters. I promised him I would make sure you were taken care of. Another lie. David had never worried about my ability to manage money, and he certainly hadn't asked Michael to control my finances. My phone buzzed again. We're done. Let him leave naturally in the next few minutes. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Maybe we could continue this conversation tomorrow? Michael looked disappointed, but nodded understandingly. Of course. This is a lot to process. But Sarah, I want you to know that Linda and I consider you family. We'll always be here for you. After he left, I sat in David's chair and cried for the first time since receiving that message at the funeral. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of relief that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. At midnight, Jake called with an update that exceeded our wildest hopes. We found everything, Sarah. Financial records showing exactly how the money laundering worked, lists of Romano's associates, drug shipment schedules, and most importantly, recorded conversations between Michael and Romano discussing David's death. Recorded conversations? Michael was wearing a wire during some of his meetings with Romano. Not because he was cooperating with law enforcement, but because Romano demanded proof that his orders were being carried out. Michael recorded his own confession to murdering his brother. The irony was perfect. Michael's paranoid desire to prove his loyalty to criminals had created the evidence that would convict him. There's more, Jake continued. We also found evidence that Michael has been stealing from the construction company for over 2 years. Fake invoices, forged checks, and missing equipment that was sold on the side. David's death was just the final step in a plan to take over the entire business. When do we arrest him? Tomorrow morning. Romano and his associates are being picked up tonight during their meeting at the construction office. By dawn, the entire operation will be shut down. And David? When can I see David? He's on his way to your house right now. The danger is over, Sarah. You can stop pretending to be a widow. 20 minutes later, I heard a car door close in my driveway. Through the window, I saw a figure walking slowly toward my front door. Even in the darkness, even after 2 weeks of believing he was dead, I recognized the way David moved, the shape of his shoulders, the careful way he stepped over the loose board on our front porch. I opened the door before he could knock, and for a moment we just stared at each other across the threshold that separated the living from the supposedly dead. Hello, beautiful, David said softly, using the same words he had spoken to me every morning for 32 years. I threw myself into his arms, feeling his solid warmth and familiar scent, proving to myself that this wasn't another dream or hallucination. David was alive, really alive, and the nightmare was finally over. "I'm so sorry," he whispered against my hair. "I'm so sorry I put you through this, but it was the only way to protect you and stop Michael." We held each other on our front porch for a long time, reconnecting after the most difficult 2 weeks of our lives. When we finally went inside, David looked around at the house he had built, at the life we had shared, as if seeing it all for the first time. "I watched your funeral from the woods behind the cemetery," I told him. "Jake showed me the evidence you collected. But I still don't understand how Michael could plan to murder his own brother." David's expression darkened. "Greed, Sarah. Pure greed. Michael owes Romano's people over $200,000 in gambling debts. They threatened to kill Linda and the children if he didn't find a way to pay. When he couldn't steal enough from the company accounts, Romano suggested a more permanent solution. Michael could have come to us for help. We would have found a way to pay his debts. I offered that when he first confessed to the money laundering. But by then, Romano owned him completely. Michael had become too valuable as an insider in a legitimate business. They weren't going to let him walk away, and they weren't going to let me expose their operation. The plan had been diabolically simple. Michael would poison David's morning coffee with a substance that would cause symptoms resembling a heart attack. With David dead, Michael would inherit half the construction business and gain access to the life insurance money. More importantly, he would eliminate the only person who could expose Romano's money laundering operation. But why fake your death instead of just going to the police? Because we weren't sure who else was involved. Romano has connections in local government, maybe even in law enforcement. If we had gone to the police too early, evidence could have disappeared and witnesses could have been silenced. David explained how Jake Morrison had helped him create a new identity and arrange for the body switch at the morgue. The homeless man who had died of a genuine heart attack became David's stand-in, while David disappeared into a safe house to coordinate the investigation with federal agents. "The hardest part was watching you grieve," David said, taking my hands in his. "I wanted to comfort you, to end your pain, but I knew that if Michael suspected I was alive, he would have no choice but to kill you too." At 6 a.m., as the sun rose over Millbrook, police cars surrounded Michael's house. I watched from our kitchen window as they led him away in handcuffs, his face shocked and confused. Linda stood in their driveway holding Emma and Jake, crying as she realized that her husband was not the man she had married. "What happens to them?" I asked David. "To Linda and the children?" "They'll be okay eventually." Linda had no idea what Michael was involved in. "The children are innocent. They'll have to live with the shame of what their father did, but they'll survive." The arrest made headlines throughout the region. Local construction company owner arrested in money laundering scheme. Brother accused of planning murder for insurance money. Federal agents bust multi-million-dollar drug operation. But the headline that mattered most to me was the one that never appeared. Husband returns from the dead to expose brother's betrayal. That was our private victory, our secret triumph over evil that had tried to destroy our family. 3 days after Michael's arrest, Linda brought Emma and Jake to our house. The children looked confused and frightened, unable to understand why their beloved father was suddenly gone and why everyone was treating him like a bad person. "I don't know what to say to you," Linda said, her eyes red from crying. "I had no idea what Michael was involved in. I thought he was just working hard to provide for us." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "None of this is your fault or the children's fault." But how could I not know? How could I live with him for 15 years and not see that he was capable of planning to murder his own brother? It was a question I had been asking myself about my own blindness to Michael's true nature. How do you live so closely with someone and miss the signs that they're living a double life? David joined us in the living room, and Emma immediately ran to him, crying with relief that her uncle was alive after all. "Uncle David, Daddy said you were dead, but you're not dead." "No, sweetheart, I'm not dead. But your daddy made some very bad choices, and now he has to go away for a while." Jake, who was older and understood more, stayed close to his mother. "Is Daddy a bad man now?" he asked. David knelt to Jake's eye level. "Your daddy is still your daddy, and he still loves you. But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt other people, and when that happens, they have to face consequences." Linda and I talked for hours while David kept the children occupied in his workshop. She told me about the changes she had noticed in Michael over the past year, his increased stress, secretive phone calls, and unexplained absences. She had attributed it all to business pressure and the normal challenges of running a company. "And were nights when he couldn't sleep," she admitted. "He would pace around the house or sit on the porch until dawn. When I asked what was wrong, he always said it was just work problems." "Michael was probably wrestling with his conscience," I said. "Part of him knew what he was planning was wrong, but he felt trapped by his debts and his fear of Romano's people. The FBI agents told me Michael owes over $200,000 to illegal gambling operations. I had no idea he was even gambling, let alone that deeply in debt." Michael's trial began 4 months later. The evidence against him was overwhelming: recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimony from Romano's associates who were cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. David and I testified about the suspicious circumstances surrounding his supposed death and the evidence we had gathered during the investigation. I described receiving the text messages and finding the materials David had hidden at our cabin. David explained how he had discovered Michael's involvement with money laundering and the threats against his life. The most damaging testimony came from Vincent Romano himself, who had decided to cooperate fully with prosecutors. He described in detail how Michael had approached him about laundering money through the construction company and how the plan to eliminate David had been developed. "Michael Mitchell came to me with the idea," Romano testified. "He said his brother was threatening to expose our business arrangement and that the only solution was to eliminate the threat permanently." Michael's defense attorney tried to portray him as a victim of circumstances, a man who had gotten in over his head with dangerous people and made desperate choices to protect his family. But the evidence showed careful planning and deliberate betrayal that went far beyond desperation. On the witness stand, Michael looked like a broken man. The confident, successful businessman who had comforted me at David's funeral was gone, replaced by someone hollow and defeated. When the prosecutor asked him directly if he had planned to murder his brother, Michael broke down completely. "I never wanted David to die," he sobbed. "I loved my brother. But Romano's people said they would kill Linda and the children if I didn't cooperate. They said David would never stop trying to expose them, and the only way to protect my family was to eliminate the threat." "So you decided to poison your brother's coffee and let his wife believe he had died of natural causes?" "I thought if everyone believed it was a heart attack, no one would investigate. Sarah would be sad, but she would move on eventually. I never thought about how much it would hurt her." "And the life insurance money?" Michael's voice was barely audible. "I needed money to pay off my debts and disappear with my family. I thought with David gone, and the insurance money, we could start over somewhere else." It was a confession that destroyed any remaining sympathy I might have had for my brother-in-law. Michael hadn't just planned to kill David, he had planned to steal from me and abandon me to deal with the aftermath alone. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, fraud, and racketeering. Michael was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Vincent Romano received a life sentence for running a criminal enterprise that had terrorized the region for over a decade. Several of his associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. After the trial, Linda moved back to her hometown with Emma and Jake. She divorced Michael and returned to nursing, trying to rebuild a life for her children away from the shame and notoriety of their father's crimes. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust anyone again," she told me during one of our last conversations. "If Michael could lie to me so completely, how do I know when someone is telling the truth?" It was a feeling I understood completely. The betrayal by someone you love and trust changes something fundamental about how you see the world. Even though David and I had survived the conspiracy against us, we both struggled with the aftermath of learning that family loyalty could be bought and sold. David decided to dissolve David Construction rather than try to continue operating a business that had been so thoroughly corrupted. The name itself had become associated with criminal activity in the local media, making it impossible to maintain client relationships. 30 years of building a reputation, and Michael destroyed it all in less than 2 years, David said, as we cleaned out his office for the final time. But there were also positive outcomes from the terrible experience. The federal investigation led to the exposure of corruption in local government and the construction industry. Several public officials were arrested for taking bribes from Romano's organization. New oversight procedures were implemented to prevent money laundering through legitimate businesses. Most importantly, David and I had survived an ordeal that could have destroyed our marriage and our lives. The experience had tested our love and trust in ways we never could have imagined, but it had also proven that our bond was stronger than any external threat. "We're like that old song," David said one evening as we sat on our front porch, watching the sunset over the town where we had spent our entire adult lives. "We've been through fire and flood, and we're still standing." "But we're different now," I replied. "We can't go back to the innocent people we were before all this happened." "No, we can't. But maybe being different isn't necessarily bad. Maybe we needed to learn that we're stronger than we thought, that our love can survive even the worst betrayal." The house David had built was still our home, but it felt different now. Some rooms held memories of happier times with Michael and his family, Sunday dinners, and holiday celebrations that would never happen again. Other rooms had been changed by the investigation, searched by federal agents, and examined as evidence in a criminal conspiracy. But gradually, we began creating new memories to layer over the painful ones. We hosted dinners for friends who had supported us through the ordeal. We welcomed visits from former students who had heard about our experience and wanted to offer encouragement. We slowly reclaimed our lives from the shadow of Michael's betrayal. The hardest part was learning to trust again. Not just trusting other people, but trusting our own judgment about people's character. If we had been so wrong about Michael, how could we be sure about anyone else? It was a question that would take years to fully answer, but we began by trusting each other completely. Whatever doubts we might have about the outside world, we knew that our love was real and our commitment to each other was absolute. 2 years after Michael's conviction, I received a letter from him in federal prison. I stared at the envelope for a long time before deciding to open it, unsure if I was ready to hear what he had to say. "Dear Sarah," it began in handwriting that looked older and more uncertain than the confident script I remembered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to ask for it. I just need you to know how sorry I am for what I put you and David through." The letter was 5 pages long, filled with regret and attempts at explanation that felt hollow after everything that had happened. Michael described his life in prison, the violence and isolation, the constant fear of other inmates who knew about his crimes. He had been placed in protective custody after being attacked by prisoners who had their own codes about family betrayal. "I think about David every day," he wrote. "Not just about what I plan to do to him, but about all the years he took care of me, taught me everything I knew about construction, treated me like a son instead of just a younger brother. I destroyed the best relationship in my life for money I never even got to spend." Michael also wrote about Linda and the children, how his actions had destroyed their lives, along with ours. Linda had been forced to declare bankruptcy after legal fees and the collapse of Michael's business interests. Emma was struggling in school, ashamed of her father's notoriety. Jake had become withdrawn and angry, acting out in ways that worried his teachers and counselors. "I told myself I was protecting my family," Michael continued, "but I was really just protecting myself. I was too proud to ask David for help with my gambling debts, too scared to face Romano's threats like a man. So I chose the coward's way out and convinced myself it was justified." The letter ended with a request that I knew I couldn't fulfill. "If you ever feel able to forgive me, please tell David that I'm sorry. Tell him that his little brother died the day he decided to betray him, and what's left in this prison cell isn't worth his anger or his grief." I showed the letter to David, and we talked about whether Michael's remorse was genuine or just another manipulation by someone who had proven he couldn't be trusted. "I think he's sorry," David finally said. "But being sorry doesn't change what he did or bring back the 2 weeks you spent thinking I was dead. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive him?" David was quiet for a long time. "Maybe someday. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending it didn't happen." Michael chose money over family, and that choice has consequences that last forever. We decided not to respond to the letter, but we kept it as a reminder of how far our lives had come since that terrible day at the cemetery. Michael would spend the next 23 years in prison while we rebuilt our life together. The financial aftermath of Michael's crimes took months to resolve. The life insurance company initially refused to pay David's policy, claiming that fraud voided the coverage. But our attorney argued successfully that David's fake death was justified self-defense against a murder plot, not insurance fraud for personal gain. Eventually, we received a settlement that was less than the full policy amount, but enough to provide security for our retirement years. More importantly, we recovered most of David's business assets that Michael hadn't already stolen or lost to gambling debts. David used some of the insurance money to start a nonprofit organization that provided construction services for low-income families and disaster victims. He called it honest work, and it became his way of rebuilding the reputation that Michael had destroyed. "I want people to know that construction can be about helping families build dreams," David explained. "Not just about laundering money for criminals." I returned to teaching with renewed purpose, using my experience to help students understand the importance of making ethical choices, even when facing difficult circumstances. I developed a curriculum about personal integrity and moral courage that became popular throughout our school district. "Mrs. Mitchell really knows what she's talking about when she teaches about doing the right thing," I overheard one student tell another. She and her husband went through something really scary, and they never gave up on each other or on justice. 3 years after the trial, Vincent Romano died in federal prison, reportedly killed by rival gang members who blamed him for exposing their operations during his cooperation with prosecutors. His death marked the end of the criminal organization that had terrorized our region for over a decade. "It's finally over," David said when we heard the news. "Romano can't hurt anyone else, and his associates are either in prison or scattered to other parts of the country." But the effects of Romano's crimes continued to ripple through our community. Several businesses that had unknowingly laundered money through their operations faced bankruptcy and legal challenges. Families whose loved ones had been killed by Romano's organization finally had some sense of closure, but justice couldn't bring back the dead. The federal investigation also revealed corruption that went far deeper than we had imagined. Two county commissioners, the building inspector, and a state legislator were convicted of taking bribes from Romano's organization. The scandal led to electoral reforms and new oversight procedures that made it harder for criminal organizations to buy influence in local government. Jake Morrison, the private investigator who had helped us expose the conspiracy, became something of a local hero. His work on our case led to a federal contract investigating organized crime throughout the region. He established an office in Millbrook and hired additional investigators to handle the increased workload. "Your case broke everything wide open," Jake told us during a dinner at our house. Romano's organization was like a cancer that had spread throughout the area's business and political networks. Exposing them has made the whole region safer for honest people. 4 years after Michael's conviction, Linda brought Emma and Jake to visit us. The children had grown and changed dramatically, both physically and emotionally. Emma, now a teenager, was quiet and serious, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Jake had channeled his anger into athletics, becoming a star player on his high school football team. "They're good kids," Linda told us privately. "But they carry scars from what their father did." Emma still has nightmares about FBI agents searching our house. Jake gets into fights when other kids make jokes about his dad being in prison. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Better than I expected, honestly. Nursing keeps me busy, and the kids and I have gotten closer through all this. We're like survivors of the same disaster, taking care of each other." Linda had started a support group for families of white-collar criminals, helping other women whose husbands had been arrested for fraud, embezzlement, or other financial crimes. She understood the unique shame and isolation that comes from discovering that the person you loved most was living a secret life of deception. "The hardest part isn't the financial problems or even the social stigma," she explained. "It's learning to trust your own judgment again. If you could be so wrong about someone you lived with every day, how do you know if you're right about anything else?" During that visit, Emma asked David a question that surprised all of us with its directness and maturity. "Uncle David, do you hate my father?" David considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't hate him, Emma. I'm disappointed in the choices he made, and I'm angry about the pain he caused your family and mine. But hate is too strong and too destructive an emotion to carry around. But he tried to kill you." "Yes, he did. And that was wrong, and he's paying the consequences for it. But your father is still your father, and he still loves you, even though he made terrible mistakes." Emma nodded solemnly. "I still love him too, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to respect him again." It was a wise and heartbreaking observation from a young person who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Michael's crimes had stolen not just money and security from his children, but also their ability to see their father as a hero and role model. 5 years after that devastating day at the cemetery, David and I had built a new life on the foundation of our surviving love. We were different people than we had been before, Michael's betrayal more cautious, more aware of human capacity for deception, but also more grateful for genuine loyalty and honesty. Our house was still filled with David's handcrafted furniture, but we had added new pieces that represented our post-conspiracy life. A dining table where we hosted dinners for Jake Morrison and other friends who had helped us through the crisis. Bookshelves that held legal documents from the trial alongside photo albums of happier times. A hope chest David had made to store letters from students and community members who had been inspired by our story. "We survived something that destroys a lot of families," David said on our 37th wedding anniversary. We're stronger now than we were before in ways we never could have imagined. The scars were still there, moments of doubt when we wondered if we were naive to trust anyone. Flashbacks to the terror of those 2 weeks, when I thought David was dead. Anger that flared when we remembered how completely Michael had deceived us. But love had proven stronger than betrayal, and truth had ultimately triumphed over deception. Justice had been served, but more importantly, we had learned that some bonds cannot be broken by external forces, no matter how powerful or corrupt. Our marriage had survived the ultimate test, and we were ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Today, 7 years after that impossible text message changed my life forever, I'm sitting on the front porch David built with his own hands, watching the sun set over the town where we've spent our entire adult lives together. David is beside me in the rocking chair he crafted last spring, reading a book about sustainable construction techniques for his nonprofit work. The peace we've found isn't the innocent contentment we had before Michael's betrayal. It's deeper and more precious because we know how easily it can be lost. We've learned to appreciate simple moments, morning coffee, evening conversations, the sound of David's tools in his workshop in ways we never did when we took them for granted. Last month, I retired from teaching after 43 years in education. My final class was full of students whose parents had followed our story in the media, and they were curious about what we had learned from our experience. "Mrs. Mitchell," one student asked, "how did you know who to trust after your brother-in-law lied to you about everything?" It was a profound question from a 12-year-old, and I thought carefully before answering. "You start by trusting people who have proven themselves over time," I said. Uncle David and I learned to trust each other completely again by being completely honest about everything, even when the truth was difficult. Then we gradually learned to trust friends who stood by us during the hardest time of our lives. But what if you're wrong about someone again? Then you deal with that when it happens. Being wrong about one person doesn't mean you should stop trusting everyone.